Okay. My name is Carrie Strathy, and I'm the division head at the University of Regina Lifelong Learning Center. We have a very special presentation being made today as the third of our four Indigenous History Month celebration presentations being offered in June, which is National Indigenous Month in Canada. And the University of Regina is situated on Treaty 4 territory with a presence in Treaty 6. These are the ancestral territories of the Cree, the Saulteaux, the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and the traditional homeland of the Métis. These have been an important part of our history and will be equally significant for our future. I would like to now take the opportunity to introduce our guest speaker for the day. Russ Mirasty became Saskatchewan's 23rd Lieutenant Governor in July of 2019, and he's the first Indigenous person to serve in this role. His Honor, the Honourable Russ Mirasty, Lieutenant Governor of Saskatchewan, has been a very influential person in terms of helping people to understand many things related to Indigenous people. He was born and raised in La Ronge, Saskatchewan, and His Honor is a member of the Lac La Ronge Indian Band and fluent in Cree. He joined the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or RCMP as we more commonly refer to it, in 1976, and he was posted to 7 provinces and performed duties in every province and territory. He also participated in exchange with the Northern Territory Police Service in Australia, which I'm sure must have been a very interesting experience, having spent a week myself in Darwin and had a chance to go out and visit some Aboriginal communities around that area. Following his retirement from the RCMP, Mr. Mirasty helped to lead educational initiatives and served on several boards to reduce poverty and promote community safety. His Honor leads a very active lifestyle and regularly participates in running and cross-country skiing marathon events. He and his wife, Donna Mirasty, have a home in La Ronge, and they have 2 children and grandchildren. And unfortunately, due to other commitments, she's not able to be with us today, but we are honored to have the Honorable Russ Mirasty here to speak to us. So I will turn it over to you.
Well, good morning, and thank you very much for that nice introduction. I really am pleased to join you today. And I guess, first of all, I want to say in my own language, it just means that I'm very thankful for the invitation to be with you here today. I am joining you as already the land acknowledgement, but I am at Cumberland House here in Regina, which is in Treaty 4 territory and homeland of the Métis, although I personally come from Treaty 6 in La Ronge. I want to thank the University of Regina Lifelong Learning Center for providing this forum and enabling people to share, I guess is the best way to put it, and so that we can all end up in a place where we better understand each other. I've been asked today to share my personal story with you, and following the remarks, there will be time for comments and or questions, and I'm very much looking forward to that part of it. So, my story, I've shared this a number of times, and every time I start to think about it, you know, almost like it evolves somewhat. I mean, I guess currently speaking, but also even thinking about, the more you think about something, the more things become evident to an individual. But as was stated in my bio, I was born in La Ronge and raised on the adjacent First Nation, which is still known as the Lac La Ronge Indian Band, which is a bit of an anomaly to retain a band in the name, but that's what the leaders and the elders have chosen. And so we remain with that name. My mom, brother, and I lived with my grandparents in a small 2-room house on the reserve with no electricity or running water, which was common then. And my grandparents spoke only Cree, and they did not attend school at any time. Although they understood a little bit of English because of their interaction with people, non-Indigenous people in and around the community, Cree was their language. And hence, they looked at the world in a much different way and were a major influence on me to this day, and certainly during my upbringing. And I think about them a lot because of who they were and how they contributed to my upbringing and to who I am. So that language, very important, was also my first language. And really, we didn't have a choice, obviously, in terms of growing up there. But I learned many other things from them. And I know that part of the topic today is to reflect on how one's upbringing influences how they view the world today and what they do today and how they do that. And so I'm hoping to be able to weave that throughout here. So I learned generosity and welcoming to all. There was never a time where my grandparents would turn anybody away from the door. And there was no such thing as calling ahead to set up a time for tea in Bannock. It was really a knock on the door, open the door and come in, and whoever you were welcomed, you were offered certainly at a minimum a cup of tea, but also anything else that they could share. And I think aligned with that, or along with that, learning about respecting people and accepting who they were, regardless of where they came from and who they were, for that matter. And the hospitality, obviously, along with that. So the general sense of accepting people for who they were and welcome them into your circle without any boundaries or expectations. The traditional lifestyle was also very important. You know, we talk about that word traditional lifestyle, but for them, my grandparents, that was their life. It wasn't about traditions. That's just who they were and how they grew up and how they lived. And we call it traditional now, I guess, to frame it in a bit of a different way. But, you know, through hunting and fishing, trapping, and that connection to the land, you know, that's just who they were. And I learned from that. And to this very day, being out on the land, being out in the woods, participating in the things that we do now, it is very important to me. And quite frankly, without it, I think I would be lost. So that was kind of, you know, the early foundation of who I am. Unfortunately, when I was about 4 years old, I was diagnosed with tuberculosis, which was quite common in those days, but we couldn't be treated locally in La Ronge. And people, children and adults and whoever, and both Indigenous and non-Indigenous were sent to sanatoriums throughout the province. And I had relatives that went to Prince Albert, to Saskatoon, and I personally was sent to Fort San in the Qu'Appelle Valley, adjacent to Fort Qu'Appelle. I don't remember much about those days at 4 years old, except for these huge cavernous hallways that were always brightly lit, and some fleeting images of the staff, but other than that, I don't recall. And the other thing that happened during that time was learning English. And I guess I know that now, and it's clear that, you know, that age, children learn the quickest and the best, and their minds are just so much like sponges. And so I learned quite a bit of English during I was there almost a year. So when I was cured, I suppose, I was taken back home. And when I arrived, a local nurse drove me to the house that I left, and I am told that I stepped out of the car and looked at this little house and said, well, I don't live here. In English, I declared that, this wasn't where I lived, and was very upset, as told by my grandmother. And people weren't sure what to do with my, I guess, reaction to returning home. And my grandmother just said in her gentle way, just give him time. And of course, it wasn't long before, I adjusted to being back home. So I began school shortly after that, a couple of years after that, in La Ronge. There were no schools on reserve at that time. And that's aside from the residential schools, which I'll get into in a moment here. But I attended kindergarten and grade 1 in La Ronge in the town. So the school population was very mixed. And I don't know what the percentage would be, but a lot of children from the reserve going to school in the town of La Ronge. And after grade 1, and to this day, I don't really know for certain why, I was told that I would be going to school in Prince Albert and attending the Indian residential school there. And that in itself was a 4-year experience. We were all, I guess to go back a step, we all were brought together in the town of La Ronge near what was called Athabasca Airways, which is a waterplane base. And the reason for that was children were being flown in from outlying communities, including Stanley Mission and Grandmother's Bay, to also, I guess, continue their journey to Prince Albert to the residential school. So we were all there congregated, and then we were loaded onto buses to make the long trip to Prince Albert. At that time was a very long trip because it was on an older highway than what is there now. But so we made that trip, and I did that for 4 years, spending 4 years there. And I won't get into too much detail there, but certainly, again, an experience that was obviously not positive, in the sense that here I was at 6, 7 years old, being loaded onto a bus and then unloaded in this place in Prince Albert, which was totally foreign, obviously, to all of us children. And we initially, at least, were in dormitories that housed about 30 of us boys, and knew a couple of them, but for the vast majority didn't. These dorms were supervised by usually a couple or a family that lived at one end, kind of separated from the dorm. And they oversaw, I guess, our care and how we conducted ourselves there. And everything we did was in a group. And from getting up in the morning to making our beds, to cleaning up around our beds, which were bunk beds, and then going as a group to the meals, to breakfast, and then off to school. Now the school is a little bit different than some of what you might have learned. The school, because of the number of students in this place, there wasn't the capacity to actually teach us on site. So we were actually sent out to schools in the city of Prince Albert. And ours, the group that I was with, went to Arthur Peachy in Prince Albert, which was, it seemed like a long walk at the time, but when I go back now and look at it, it's really not that far. But being cognizant of time, I won't get into too much more, except that it was, a very different experience, very structured, very disciplined, and obviously being far away from home. After grade 5, I was told that I would be remaining in La Ronge. Again, no explanation, that just the way it was. And I finished elementary school and high school in La Ronge. And of note there is that throughout those years, there was a gradual decrease in the number of students from the reserve until at the very end, when I graduated, I was standing alone. I was the only person graduating that year from the reserve. And to this very day, I often wonder about that, and I've thought about it a lot, and to some degree understand why, and I know some of the reasons that happened, but certainly those impacts, if you will, of diminished attendance are evident today. You know, I did well academically. I participated in all school sports, and if I look back, and I hear this, it's kind of a common theme. A lot of Indigenous students that kind of remained in school, sports was a big part of that. We were able to compete and be competitive in sports. And so that was a very positive thing for me. So in high school, of course, it's normal to have those conversations about what next. And I did have those conversations in school, but we didn't have those conversations at home because it was totally an unknown kind of thought process. Because first of all, I was the first in my family to graduate, and there were others that eventually did, but just that at that time. And even that was quite an accomplishment, but there was never any discussion about, okay, what are you going to be? I mean, besides, you know, Russ Mirasty after graduating from high school, that just wasn't the so-called dinner conversation, which was fine. But at school, it was different. And I was encouraged by teachers to consider going on in school. And so because of that, and only because of that, I did go to the University of Saskatchewan for a year, but it was quite an experience in the sense that again, here I am alone, no supports. I was boarded out with a non-Indigenous family. Although I did okay academically, I just didn't feel comfortable there. And midway through the year, I decided that, you know, I need to go out and actually do some work, and find some work to support myself, and then maybe decide what I need to do. But during that thought process, and going back to my high school conversations, I decided, of course, I'm shortening this up a bit because of time, I decided that I would try the RCMP. It was one of the visible, I guess, occupations where I grew up alongside teachers and nurses and doctors. But with all of those, even in my own thinking, I wasn't sure, because I didn't see myself in any of those roles, including policing. But for some reason, I was drawn to that. So I went to the detachment in Saskatoon, and I was very nervous, of course. And I met this, it wasn't prearranged. I just went to the front counter, and this Mountie came to the front desk and asked me what I wanted. And I said, well, I'm very interested in the RCMP, and I want some more information on how to apply. Well, he looked me up and down and looked me in the face and said, literally, he said, you know, maybe you should think about this more and come back when you're really certain. I guess he probably sensed my hesitation or even nervousness, and I didn't really know what to say, and I turned and left. So I went home, and throughout the next 2 or 3 weeks, really thought about this initial experience. And for some reason, I said, you know, that's not good enough. That response just wasn't really what I wanted. But rather than go back in person, I took the easy way out and phoned the detachment. And the nice lady said, when I told her what I wanted or interested in, she said, I'll connect you with the recruiting officer. And So this nice gentleman came on and we had a chat, and he learned who I was very briefly, that I was First Nations from Orange, that I was going to university, that I was fluent in Cree. And he says, well, we need you. We want you. Certainly a different response from the initial one that I'd received a few weeks before. And he said, I'll send you some information. You have a look at it, then we'll talk again. Shorten the story, of course, I applied, was successful. And as you heard, spent 36 years in the RCMP working right across this great country of ours in many, many communities. And eventually became the commanding officer of the RCMP here in Saskatchewan, which just literally is the equivalent of being the chief of police for the province. And was really fortunate to have reached that level within the RCMP, and especially doing it in your home province. And so, you know, when I think about my career in the force, it really, again, I was fortunate, but I was also, I guess, blessed with some sense of adventure as well as curiosity, which allowed me to consider these different postings across Canada, but it also really solidified my experience as a member of the RCMP. But I always had an open mind, particularly when it came to the different regions that I was posted to, and really delved into the local community, the history, and of course that really came down to the people. And, you know, the hardworking people of that particular region, right from Newfoundland, the fishermen, but at that time, just before the cod fishery really came to an end. But thinking about the history of those fishers that had established themselves in Newfoundland, and the hard work it took to support themselves and their families, to British Columbia, northern British Columbia, and the logging industry and the hard work that was needed there, to northern Manitoba and the mining industry around Thompson, and back to Saskatchewan, you know, the farming, and thinking more about that, and the settlers. But in the meantime, of course, being Indigenous, always looking at through that lens, and in Newfoundland, really no visible Indigenous people or communities. There was one on the south coast, and other than that, really none. I mean, that's changed now, but you know, what stands out there is that two things, actually. One is that I learned that the Beothuk people were the first peoples of Newfoundland, and when Europeans settled there, there was actually a bounty on the Beothuks. Again, a very sad story indeed. But and the other thing that I recall, because of the low number of Indigenous people there, was their lack of involvement in the communities and in the economy. And that was similar across the country as I traveled. So something that stuck with me as I moved around the country. You know, it's, I guess, one of the things that really, two things that helped me along my journey. One is that the continuous support of people, mostly within the RCMP as I moved along, but all along, right from when I was a young RCMP member, and had the great fortune of meeting my wife, Donna, who is originally from Cumberland House, a Cree speaker as well. And she came to Orange for her first nursing job, and we met there, and the rest is history. So we were blessed with two wonderful children and two grandchildren. But Donna comes from Cumberland House, as I mentioned, the oldest permanent settlement in Saskatchewan. I think founded in around 1774, if I remember correctly. But an amazing community in terms of its history, but a couple of other things that stand out as I learned, as I have with other communities, the people. It is known for having the highest per capita, I guess, involvement in the world wars. So Indigenous peoples who joined, including Donna's father and uncles. And Donna's father was severely wounded during the war and came home very injured man, which affected him physically, but also psychologically when he came back to Canada. A high price to pay, but he instilled in his children the value of education and the need to get out there and do something for yourself, but also to contribute to your community in whatever way you can. So I guess the picture I'm painting here is just these fundamental, really critical aspects of both of our upbringing that contribute to our ability now and willingness to be involved in different initiatives and different programs, if you will, and different supports that we have to this very day. And she was always very, very supportive, and quite frankly, I wouldn't be here today as the Lieutenant Governor if it weren't for her support. So to move ahead here, I'm thinking of time, but I think we're doing okay. So, that career with the RCMP, obviously very instrumental in terms of where I am today. But before I get there, there's a bit of a gap. Obviously, I left the RCMP. We decided we would retire to our home in La Ronge. We built a home there some time ago. And obviously at the same time decided that that's where we would eventually retire. So we moved there after I left the RCMP. And I said, I guess in our discussions, said, I'm going to take the winter off. This was the fall. And Donna, for whatever reason, said, well, I'll give you 2 months. And it wasn't more than a day after 2 months that I received a call from the then Deputy Minister of Education for the province of Saskatchewan, asking me to participate and co-lead a province-wide engagement process on behalf of the Ministry of Education. And that engagement process was and is known as Student First. And that was my first formal involvement in the education system. I'd always had an interest in education. I recognize its value and its necessity, particularly as it relates to Indigenous communities, and of course, more broadly, the province in general. And so, did that for about a year, traveling the province, engaging with students, parents, caregivers, teachers, administrators within the public school system, and visiting First Nations as well, and then going to post-secondary, adult learning, and other organizations that are involved, Saskatchewan Teachers Federation, School Boards Association, business offices. And so really a broad spectrum to get an idea of what was working well, what wasn't working well, and what needed to change. And what a tremendous experience that was for me, and really, I guess, reinforced in me the importance of education at every level. And that fundamentally it needs to be fairly and equitably accessible to everybody. And so very much of a learning experience for me. And I also, after that work, became involved with a group, well, I guess formerly known as an advisory group on poverty reduction for the province of Saskatchewan. Again, getting an inside look into poverty and its causes, and potentially how we could end poverty here in the province. Of course, that's work that continues. And so I did some other work with the province in different ministries as I use the term loosely, as an advisor, and enjoyed that. And then I received the call out of the blue. There was no forewarning. It was from Ottawa, asking if I would let my name stand as a potential candidate for Lieutenant Governor of the province of Saskatchewan. And really, it was a bit of a shock because, like I say, it was totally unexpected. And I kind of chuckle at times because I've been asked the question, how did you prepare yourself to be Lieutenant Governor? Or how did you apply to become Lieutenant Governor, from younger people? And of course, the answer is you don't. I mean, it's not a job you can apply for. And in any event, I was fortunate enough to get the support of my family, Donna for certain, and my children, and my community. And I said yes, and I don't know how many other candidates there were. I guess it doesn't really matter, because at the end of the day, I received the call from the Prime Minister and formally asking me, and of course I accepted, as is clearly evident. I'm here now. And so I've been doing that now for this role for almost 2 years. Next month, it will be 2 years completed, which seems unbelievable to me how time flies, particularly with the challenges that we've faced with COVID over the last almost year and a half now. And so to go back to kind of part of the theme of this conversation, and I think I've touched on a number of those areas. How did, my growing up and who I am influences, I guess, in the present tense, what I do today as a Lieutenant Governor, as the Queen's representative here in the province of Saskatchewan, or for the province of Saskatchewan. And I bring that lens, that Indigenous lens, that Cree lens to everything I do here. Remembering that, of course, I represent every citizen in the province of Saskatchewan. And so I started in the role by really, I think, wanting to make sure that not only that I wouldn't forget, but also to send a message to, I guess, the broader province of who I am. Not that they needed reminding, I don't think, but during my official installation, at the day of my installation, let me start there, we raised a teepee on the House of Government, or the grounds of Government House rather, and I hosted a pipe ceremony that was conducted by elders, local elders, to make sure that we brought that day, but also my time as Lieutenant Governor, in the right and proper way. And at my official installation, I wore moccasins that I had specifically commissioned from a lady in Grandmother's Bay in northern Saskatchewan. And I wore those. And I remember having a conversation a couple of weeks before that with my principal secretary, Heather Saloom, about the dress. And he said, well, normally it would be a morning suit. And I had an idea of what that was. And so I said, okay. And I was fitted for that. And there was discussion about the shoes, which were normally patent leather. These, everybody knows what they are, very shiny. And I said, well, what if I want to wear moccasins? And Heather said, without hesitation, absolutely, you wear what you want. And so I wore the moccasins along with the morning suit, and I'm glad that I did on a personal level, but I think it also sent a message. And so that was the start of what is now 2 years past. And this past week, we raised a teepee here on Government House grounds, where a teepee had been brought in before for special events, but this was the first time that a teepee that was purchased and is owned now by the Lieutenant Governor's office will remain here and used for special occasions. And this was raised last week following appropriate protocols and ceremony with elders. And so that was raised in preparation for National Indigenous Peoples Day next week. And so I guess really to continue that, my personal, but also now professional journey as Lieutenant Governor, but at the same time, making sure that who I am is a part of this office. And in the broader kind of perspective, really, I've always had an interest and believed in reconciliation and strong relationships between peoples and communities. And as I continue this work, I will continue to, I guess, reinforce that aspect of the work and my personal approach to the work. So now we're at the present, and I think just to make sure that there's time, I will pause there for any questions. I'm not sure how that's going to be facilitated, but please feel free to either offer commentary or ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you. And I will turn it over to Hertha to explain how we will handle questions, both written questions if you want to use the chat, or you can unmute yourself and do questions verbally. So are there any questions people would like to ask in the chat feature? Or would you like to unmute yourself and ask your questions in person?
Yes, Russ, when you were in Prince Albert at the residential school, did you get to go home for holidays or Christmas?
Yes, pardon me. Yes, we were allowed to go home at Christmas. And so we were taken again on those buses and returned right after the new year and back to Prince Albert. So we did have that one opportunity each year to go home.
I'll ask a question just to get things started. You said that you lived in 7 different provinces and also had the opportunity to go to Northern Australia. So I'm curious to know which place you found most interesting and maybe why.
Well, I think I kind of went over that fairly quickly, but you know, not any one place really stands out because they were all new experiences for me and my family, and because of how I guess look at those experiences, they were all very positive, including Northern Australia, or the Northern Territory rather of Australia, and traveled extensively around the territory to different communities. And you know, well, one thing I will say about Australia, it does have a similar colonial history as does Canada. And the communities, unfortunately, from a policing perspective, because that was my focus then, really challenged by the same issues. And whether it came to, they don't have reserves there, but they're assigned tracts of land or assigned tracts of land around surrounding their traditional communities. And they have leadership structures, which was something that I found interesting. They don't call them chiefs. They actually have a more, I guess, colonial title. They call them presidents, and then, the council, at least with the communities that I visited. But very ravaged by alcohol abuse, and to a lesser degree at that time, drugs, and poverty, and not being included in local economies. So really some very clear similarities, although, on the other side of the world. And I guess we tie that to the colonial kind of history that both countries have. But very cultural, if I can use that more broader term. And even though they as well were discouraged from practicing their spirituality and ceremonies, and had to go into hiding really and do them in secrecy, but very strong people, obviously, and very resilient. So that really had, although I wasn't there very long, it really didn't take long to realize those similarities. And so back to your question, certainly that was a highlight, but in terms of Canada, just I had the opportunity to go up to, it was called the Northwest Territories at the time, but now part of Nunavut, and working with the Inuit for a very short period of time. But you talk about strength and resiliency. I come from northern Saskatchewan, where it's thick forests and woods and lakes, but standing on the Arctic in the March of the year, where the vegetation is literally, up to your knees or maybe thighs, these small willows, and you can see forever the stark landscape, certainly beautiful, but in the middle of winter, just incredible. And it made me think about how resilient the Inuit were in terms of surviving on that land and that environment. So, and I've had moments like that across the whole country, but those are ones that kind of stand out.
Okay, thank you. And we do now have a number of comments and questions in the chat. Hertha just got called away for a few minutes, so I will go through those.
Sure.
And the first is from March, who says, thank you for sharing your personal story and your important messages. Honored to have you as our Lieutenant Governor.
Thank you.
And the next one is from Bev. You mentioned Thompson, Manitoba. Could you say more about your experience there?
Yeah, Thompson, Manitoba was a good experience because one, it wasn't too far from home for both of us, for Don and I. And again, here's a community that's founded on the mining industry. Very successful industry there. Although it was typical of mining communities, there's ups and downs. And we were there probably during a downturn in terms of the nickel markets, but a very mixed community in the sense that it was kind of the center of northern Manitoba. So people came into Thompson for their services, even groceries, medical, hospital was there, whatever they might need. There was a Northern College, and I forget the actual formal name of it off the top of my head. But I guess what stood out for me there was, again, although I knew personally, in fact, Donna had a first cousin that worked in the mines there for 30 years. So there were Indigenous people employed at the mine, but certainly not to the extent that I would have expected, given the population in and around Thompson And so that was very clear. But overall, a very positive experience for me and my family, and my duties took me to many of the communities throughout, the flying communities throughout northern Manitoba. So again, a very much of a learning experience for me from, from a professional, but also a personal perspective.
Okay, thanks. And the next question is from Kathy. Sir, thank you for sharing your story. I have heard you once before, and I look forward to the next time I hear you. Being the Queen's representative, has there been any discussion around a formal apology from the Commonwealth?
I'm not fully understanding the question of formal policy, but
Apology.
apology. Oh,
Sorry.
okay. Oh, I heard policy. No, not that I'm aware of. I mean, that's a much longer discussion in terms of my role. And I guess when people ask me anytime about the Commonwealth or the Crown and my role as it relates to that, I find myself with a little bit of tension, if that's a nice way to put it. Because as a First Nations person, as a treaty person, as my ancestors having signed treaty with the Crown, I very much believe in those treaties and the relationship they established back when they were signed. And of course, we know the ongoing challenges to the recognition of treaty, or and sometimes the discussion or the disagreement around what their intent were and what their meaning was. And so when I came into this office, there was that bit of tension, and that's mine, personal tension, not with anybody else, about how can I represent the Queen when we know, a lot of the challenges that exist today came out of a relationship that was established in good faith through the treaties. And yet we look around our world today and, it's not where it needs to be or should have been or was envisioned. And I mean, adding to that, without overcomplicating this conversation, government policy, including the Indian Act and the reserve system and all that came with that. So I guess all I'm saying is there a bit of tension there still exists for me. And I sometimes have to just sit back and say, in my role, I'll do what I can to continue to try to strengthen that relationship, create broader understanding, but the short answer to your question was from the Commonwealth, that question, no. Yeah.
Okay. And the next question is from one of the students at Ecole Centennial in Larissa's class. And the student was wondering if you've ever been able to participate in any protest, either in Saskatchewan or in Canada.
In protests, I would have to say no, not in the sense of being front and center, but certainly, paying attention or being on the periphery as people spoke about whatever topic was being discussed that day or whatever issue was being protested. Now that's as a citizen. In terms of a police officer, yes, and again, a very challenging position to be in, but always with the approach that there's always a good way out of these particular situations.
Okay. And the next comment is from Bree, who says, "Thank you, Your Honor, for sharing your story and your experiences." And then Ryan has a question. What is your greatest advice to share with respect to how to help ourselves and our community around us to create a better future?
The one word that comes to mind, I know that this it would take a long answer, but really, and I spoke to the word when I talked about the influence of my grandparents. And that word is really respect for one another. And from that, I think, comes more understanding. And without those two, I guess, foundational words, and it'd be very difficult for us as mixed communities, and I use that term loosely, but I guess diverse communities is the proper terminology. It'll be more challenging or difficult for us to look to the future in a more collective way, to say, this is the future that we desire for ourselves, for our communities, for our children, and but that's based on a relationship of respect and understanding.
Okay. And then we have another comment, which is thank you for taking time to share your story with us, Your Honor. And that came from Kathleen. And then a comment from Suzanne. Thank you for sharing how family and community were used to inform you and do the work as you say. And she said your grandmother sounds like an amazing person and a real influencer in your life. Kristen, thank you so much for your time and sharing your story. What has your experience been like as the Lieutenant Governor of Saskatchewan, and what has been your favorite part of it?
Well, very positive experience, quite frankly. And in spite of the tension the personal tension that I've described in relationship to being First Nations and that relationship with the Crown, it's been very positive. And but as well as from Indigenous communities throughout the province, the support has been absolutely tremendous. And in terms of the best part of the experience, COVID aside, is really getting out and interacting with communities and people in every corner of the province. That's very much the highlight of this role.
Okay. So we have a question from Melanie and a comment. Thank you so much for sharing your story, Russ. I just wanted to say you are truly an amazing inspiration to me as an Indigenous lady. And I too believe and understand when you say sports actually kept us going, as I too, when I was younger, enjoyed sports, and that kept me healthy and active, and I really enjoyed sports. What kind of sports did you play?
Well, I came from a small high school or small school, so pretty well everything that you can imagine, depending on the time of year, from flag football in the fall to the track and field in the winter, of course, hockey and curling, volleyball, basketball. It wasn't until later years that I was introduced to cross-country skiing, which became our family sport and activity. And running was something I always did and still do to a lesser extent, but I enjoy getting out there just because of the exercise, but also a way of kind of personal therapy, if you will. So yeah, any sport, I think sports activity is very positive for many reasons, but those are the ones that I was involved in. And to this day, the main ones would be cross-country skiing and running.
And are you still curling?
No, we're not. It's been a few years. The last time I curled was actually when we went home to Laurent, and Don and I were involved in a fun mixed league. And we've been talking about that actually, maybe one day, going back to that.
Yeah, when the curling rinks reopen.
Yes, that's right.
So a question from June. Were there children who did not go home at Christmas? And do you know what their experience was?
I believe there were, I can't speak to this 100%, but I do recall that some children had to stay behind, and as far as what their experience was, no, I don't know that.
And Claire would like to thank you for sharing your story. And she also asks a question. Do you have any plans for after your time as Lieutenant Governor ends?
The only plan is really to go home to La Ronge and enjoy what the North has to offer us. But I said that when I left the RCMP, so who knows? But first thing will be just to go home and just enjoy the North.
Okay, and a question from Charles. Given your experience with the RCMP, how would you characterize the RCMP relationship with First Nations people in Saskatchewan?
That's a good question, and this is from my own perspective, and I'll qualify that. I think generally speaking, on an individual basis, it's good. Now, I know people would challenge that, and I appreciate that, and I respect that. But when you think of the situations that police get in, they're not often positive. And because of that, the police officers are often caught in situations that portray them in a bad way. And sometimes it's deserving, I'll say that. And a lot of times it's not. And so what I would say to, the overall relationship is that, well, it's a necessary one, because we do need law enforcement of some kind in every community. But there are different ways of approaching law enforcement and the provision of police service. And that's a term that I always prefer to use. And because it is a service to community, and it only works at its optimum if the police and the community are working hand in hand. And I know that's a work in progress, admittedly, in many communities, but I think that's what we should continue to strive for. And so that relationship, there is work to be done, for sure, absolutely. And in some communities, it's better than others, and so really it just reminds us that the work continues.
And we have an interesting question from Tina, who is from La Ronge. Good morning from La Ronge, Your Honor. Has it been an adjustment for you to have people call you Your Honor? And knowing who you are and wanting to be able to call you by your given name, sometimes we forget and call you by your first name. I was wondering how that has been for you, and is it uncomfortable for you when people do not follow that protocol?
Okay, I guess to go back in terms of whether I'm comfortable with it, not 100%. And that's being called Your Honor. And I'm being very honest with you today, as I usually am with people. But as Donna often tells people, she's the first one to jump in when there's a question about protocol and protocol, really. She says the RCMP helped us prepare for the role in that sense. And so when I was rising through the ranks of the RCMP and got to the rank of assistant commissioner, all members and employees referred to me or called me sir. So I was a little uncomfortable with that, but I also accept that that's part of really that organization and that culture. And so similarly here with the Lieutenant Governor's office, I'm a pretty, actually a low-key kind of informal kind of guy, to put it in those words. And even though the RCMP had, to some degree, had prepared me for this role, there are times that the formality is a little bit constricting. And so when people call me by my first name, I have absolutely no issue with that. because I have to appreciate also their comfort level in addressing me in a more formal way.
Mhm.
People will ask though, even this morning I was talking to a person from an First Nation, and I said, well, how are we supposed to, address you? And because I know the person, I said, no, my first name's fine. So I guess really the general rule is when I'm in public at an event, then it's the formal address. Otherwise, it's Russ.
Okay, thanks. And a very practical question. Have you met the Queen?
No, we were scheduled to fly over last May, actually. And it's usually done within the first year of taking office, which makes sense, right? You're the Queen's representative, so it makes sense to go meet the Queen and talk about the role and expectations, and then come back and finish your term. And so, yeah, that's been put on hold until I see now, though, that the Queen has been having some public visits.
Mhm.
And so, yeah, we hope that it will happen.
And from Melanie, thank you, Your Honor. Tina, thank you for all you do and have done. Thank you for bringing your culture and the North to your current role and the roles that you have had in the past. And Terry, thank you, Your Honor, for bringing our community together. Excuse me. And then we have another comment from Joyce, who says, thank you very much. What are some of your favorite? And the rest of her question did not get entered in chat. So Joyce, if you're still with us, would you like to ask that question verbally? Joyce? Okay, well, we'll move on to the next question. And if Joyce decides she wants to unmute and ask that question, she can. Da has said, thank you for your time and this presentation this morning. Will there be any formal events by the province of Saskatchewan on June 21st, National Indigenous Peoples Day?
Well, I guess I can't speak for the province, and that's where a little bit of clarity, although I work with the province, in terms of what they do as a government is totally independent of me and vice versa. So normally here at Government House, on the grounds of Government House, which are separate from the legislature, there are events that are annually held during June 21st. This year, we did raise a teepee that will stand until next week. And we did that with appropriate protocol and ceremony. For June 21st, we're also going to have a blessing, if you will, of the site where a residential school memorial will eventually be built. But we're being careful because obviously of COVID rules. And so the activities will not be the same as we would normally have here on that day, but we certainly recognize it in our own way as well.
Okay. And we have the rest of the question from Joyce. It was, what are some of your favorite foods or meals?
Oh, I don't know if Joyce knows me, but I love to cook. So my, I guess, love of food is very wide ranging. Certainly my traditional roots always pull me to nothing better than fresh fish out of the lake, and stews that include moose or rabbit or well, even fish. But so those, I guess, intuitively are probably the things that I'm most attached to. And bannock, whether it's fried or baked, which even as I speak about it, brings back different memories. But beyond that, and I think it's related to my, the travels across the country and is just experiencing the different foods that different communities have to offer. It just, it really gives you a look into a community. I mean, I'm expanding the conversation here, but I really love trying any kinds of foods.
Okay. And Hertha's back, so she is going to take over reading the chats, and we actually have quite a few of them.
Okay, thank you. And I got one from June. Thank you for your presence to us today. We appreciate your work throughout your life. Another one. This will, okay, this is a question for us, I think. This is being recorded. How can we access this and share with others? I do believe that we can, it'll be posted on our website once we get it uploaded. So probably on Monday it'll be ready. And from Brenda, sorry, checked in late. Did you talk about Monday's celebrations? Did you get that?
Yes, there was a question just a few minutes ago about that. And normally there would be different activities here at Government House, but those are really not going to take place. We did raise a teepee this week to really commemorate not only that particular day, but just to add to what we have here at Government House, particularly as it relates to Indigenous peoples. And on Monday, there will be a ceremony here to dedicate land to the future, or the site of what's to become a residential school memorial. But beyond that, there won't be too much, mainly because of COVID. And that's obviously restricts most communities and organizations, and just not the same, but we'll recognize it in our own way here at my office.
Thank you. And from Karen, I want to thank you for sharing your story with us. I am so happy to see that a member of the First Nations has been able to come this far in life and to be able to give back to others in his nation. This sets a great example for the youngest to perseverance and seeing positive life. If you have any advice for young First Nations children about life, what advice would you give?
I think that's that would be to believe in yourself, believe in who you are, really cherish where you come from, and the strengths that are inherent with who you are, particularly as an Indigenous person. I'm assuming that's where the question is coming from. But ultimately, you have to believe in yourself and be proud of who you are and what you bring to this world.
Okay, another one from Jinru. Thank you for sharing. May I ask about your experience in school beneficial to the university, and it in its content of courses same as other schools, because I have some Uyghur classmates who traveled across China to study in my high school, but for most of them, they didn't do well in the university entrance exam in China. So one of them did very well. I think it's Uyghur classmates.
Okay. Well, I think what I would say about that, and my response is obviously, I qualify that because I'm not directly involved in education or the post-secondary system right now, but I'm always paying attention. When I went to university back in the early 70s, it was a different world. And probably one of the reasons, part of the reasons I didn't stay and went looking to do something different. There were no supports, there were no organizations, there were no that supported Indigenous students. And I know that that exists today. We have First Nations University here that's, you know, an incredible organization, teaching organization and institution. And just a recognition, I guess, of the need to not only recognize, but support Indigenous students. And we see the end result really are the, you know, the numbers of people graduating from post-secondary institutions, not only in the province, but across the country. And so things obviously are changing. Again, more work needs to be done, but certainly a lot more opportunities available to students today.
Okay, that's all I got in the chat box. Unless somebody else wants to ask questions, they can unmute themselves.
I don't really have a question. I just wanted to say it's wonderful to hear. I'm not an First Nation or Indigenous person, but it's wonderful to hear all the obstacles that you've overcome to be able to be where you are, that someone would recognize you to nominate your name for a position as this, such a prestigious position. And I congratulate you, and I hope that you will, I was going to say pray, I hope that you do as much as you can for your nationality, which would also reflect on other minority groups in Canada. It's an awesome position to be in. Congratulations.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate your comments.
You're welcome.
I got another one from the chat. Good morning, Your Honor, from Buffalo Narrows. This was a true honor to witness your inauguration as the Queen's representative 2 years ago. Thank you and your wonderful wife for attending the many ceremonies within our First Nations communities throughout the years. As a fellow residential school survivor, I am proud of you and your accomplishments. Dutch Lara.
Yeah. Thank you to Dutch. I know him, yes.
And I got another one from Trudy. What would you say to students who have been accepted into university, but they are debating whether to go or not because they feel they will be ostracized from their reserve?
Yeah, I don't, I would say, you know, take the plunge. You've already applied and you're obviously being accepted. So you've, you know, have the courage to take that first step. And certainly I think that's indicative of your desire to go on. And, you know, the ostracization is something that I really can't comment to because, you know, where I come from, people are so supportive. You know, we have quite a supportive administration in terms of students that are going on to post-secondary for my community, and there's all kinds of supports in place. So I would say go. I mentioned earlier about, you know, existing supports at most, if not all, post-secondary institutions today that exist that will help you in terms of getting more comfortable in that world, but also preparing you for when you go home. I think at the end of the day, you know, your accomplishments within the education system will speak for themselves.
Thank you. And from Wendy, thank you so much for sharing some of your life experiences with us. I think that there is a book here. And from Judith, thank you very much, Your Honor. This has been the most meaningful presentation. Judith K. Hindle. And I see Kathy, if you want to unmute yourself and ask a question, you have your hand raised.
Thank you, Hertha. Thank you, Your Honor. The more I hear about the residential schools, of course, the more my heart hurts. I can't even begin to imagine but I am wanting to and starting to understand. And understanding, I think, is the first step, certainly to reconciliation. And your comment about respect leading to more understanding certainly resonates with me. And thanks for sharing that.
Thank you for your comments. And you're starting on in the right way on that journey of understanding for sure. Thank you.
From Michelin, thanks for a lot for this presentation. And that's all the comments I have right now. Carrie, I will give it back to you.
Okay, we'll have one last opportunity if anybody's got a verbal question. And if not, I will wrap it up. So I would like to take this opportunity to thank His Honor, the Honourable Russ Mirasty, for being with us today to share his experience of growing up in La Ronge and his work that he did across the country and the opportunities that he had to travel extensively and meet people doing interesting things in some very interesting places. I found that you had a lot of very interesting things to share with us, including your experience in Australia, the experience of Indigenous people in the wars. My father was a veteran and often spoke about the Indigenous soldiers that he worked with. And I had the opportunity to go with him to Ottawa to actually see the statue that was erected in memory of the Indigenous soldiers who fought in the many wars that Canada was involved in. It's very close to the Sanatoriums and the Parliament building. So if anybody goes to Ottawa, it's definitely a good place to go. And I was really pleased to hear you talk about the importance of education at all levels, partly because we are an educational institution at the Lifelong Learning Center, but more personally because I'm an adult educator myself. I would like to also extend our thanks to Heather and to Jeffrey from your office who made this possible for us. And I do hope that you will write a book. And if you need some help writing a book, we have a creative writing critique class, and several of the people who have participated in that over the years have written a variety of books about their life stories, and definitely something that people would be interested in reading. So I want to thank you again. And I'm sorry that you won't be able to have a garden party on the 1st of July. I don't think you've been able to have one yet, but
No.
maybe next year after you've had a chance to visit the Queen. So thank you again for being here and sharing your story with us as we celebrate National Indigenous History Month. And just to let people who are here know that we have one more presentation in this series. It's Jolie Big Eagle Kokudwe, and she is here next Friday, 10 o'clock, and she will be talking about the importance of the buffalo to Indigenous culture. And some of you may have heard that the pool and park that used to be called Maple Leaf are now Buffalo Meadows, and they actually just had a naming ceremony yesterday. So have a chance to go and see that and come and hear Jolie next week. Oh, and we have another comment. Somebody said that they would buy your book. So thank you for your time today. And a couple of others.
Yeah.
Do you want to do those, Hertha?
Sure. It says, thank you for the presentation. Marge, I would love to read the book. Thanks again. Allison, please write a book. Thank you for sharing with us. And Craig, Tinjay, Your Honor, thank you very much. Appreciate to hear your story and encouragement. And Foreman, I'd buy the book. Thank you for your time today. And Brenda, Dudney Park renamed, not Maple Leaf.
Yeah, sorry.
I think they named They renamed the park and the pool at the same time, I think. And from Dar Baltrov, thank you, Lieutenant Governor Mirasty and the U of R staff. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I think you now have an answer to that question about what you're doing next.
Well, yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to be with you here today, and certainly all the comments that were sent in. It makes it easier, I guess, for me to share my story when people are interested. But as is customary for the Lieutenant Governor, at any or most events, I bring greetings, formal greetings on behalf of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. So I do that now. But as an extension of that, and what I referred to earlier about bringing myself into this office, I translated the greeting into Cree, and I use that quite often now. And I'll do that. I'll end by doing that. So. Elizabeth II, Canada. Thank you very much.